It's a fascinating area, the human brain. It's so complex that when we start to look at it, we wonder how it works. We are fascinated by what makes us tick. And you're a lot more than your brain. This is an important point. You know, you can analyze your brain, you can look at your brain. In fact, if, for example, part of your brain no longer worked, you could still be aware of that and work around that. And if you think about it, when you drink too much, for example, parts of your brain shut down, and you can be aware of the fact that you're drunk, and you can work very hard to try and work purposefully around the fact that you've had too much alcohol to drink. So you're not simply a function of your brain, you're a lot more than that. And so part of my interest is in saying, well, where is the ghost in the machine? You know, which parts of the brain relate to the different parts of you? And so if I was to ask you right now, how are you? You'd probably you give different responses. And usually when I ask somebody, well, how are they? They'll pause for a moment and go, and they might say, well, I'm feeling frustrated, or I'm feeling cold, or I'm feeling anxious, or I'm hungry, or I'm happy, or I'm enthusiastic. But there's that pause. And so the question is, what are you doing in that pause? Well, one part of your brain is asking another part of the brain on how you are. And if you look at that Neuroscience 101 slide, the frontal lobe here is the part that's doing the asking. And the temporal lobe and this emotional part here is the part that it is asking. So part of you is asking part of you how you are, and you come up with a response. And when those two are in alignment, then we get a sense of clarity, a sense of certainty. And so tonight what we're going to be looking at are the 6 big breakthroughs in neuroscience that change the way we lead, build teams, communicate, solve problems, and live life. So these are the breakthroughs that have really only started to show through in neuroscience in the last 10 years. It's amazing to think that our brain is a social brain. As a social brain, we think in terms of the tribe. And so we're going to be looking at these 6 big breakthroughs in terms of the 6 needs that we have, or the 6 preferences that our brain has when it's dealing as a member of a tribe. And if you think of team building or leadership or entrepreneurship, these things are all linked to the tribe. They're all linked to the way you perform with a group of people. So here's the first breakthrough. The first number 1 breakthrough is relatedness. Relatedness is everything. The brain is wired to look at how you relate to the rest of the group. If you think about yourself right now, what are the groups that you belong to? How do you define yourself? You've got your family, you've got your work, you've got your teams, you've got those that you like and those that you don't. This is all part of the way the brain thinks. And in fact, the R in relatedness we sometimes refer to as role, because the frontal lobe thinks of relatedness in terms of the role you play. So if I was to say, what are all the roles you have in life? You might say, well, I'm a mother or a father or a husband or a wife. I'm a friend, I'm a son, I'm a daughter, I'm a boss, I'm a follower, I'm a salesperson, I'm a taxi driver. All of these are roles, and it tells of the value that you add a group of people. Your brain is profoundly wired to emphasize how clear that role is. If you are not liked but you're valued by the team, your brain settles down. The brain loves to be needed. Now, the brain also loves to be loved, but that's another whole functional network. So this relatedness function is a circuit. It's an actual group. We can track in the brain the parts of the brain that this accesses. And in fact, it determines a lot of whether or not your brain is in emergency mode or whether you're able to relax. Relatedness is everything. Now, sometimes you can have teams, and you may be a member of a team, where you've got too much relatedness. In other words, there isn't any room whatsoever for your own individual perspective. Sometimes at home you may feel that your mother or father has, they have such strong views of who you are, but that there's no real room for you. Sometimes you can be part of a community group or at work. There can be so much connectedness that you wouldn't dare put forward a different perspective. In the 1970s, they used to call this group think. This is where if you get a group of people together who all identify as part of the same group, if one or two members of that group have a very strong opinion about a given topic, often they can swing the whole group around because nobody wants to feel as though the group is breaking apart. This comes back to a very basic, primitive need that we have to feel as though we're at the very center of the group, valued by the group. Now, in commercial terms, in team building terms, this isn't good. This leads to often the leader has a very strong perspective and everybody in the group simply follows. You end up with a whole group of people thinking the same, acting the same, dressing the same, enjoying the same things, buying the same things, eating at the same restaurants. In a corporate context, this can sometimes be mistaken for genuine teamwork. So often family organisations or older organisations. We're working with a series of organisations at the moment. One's a museum, one's a transport organisation. They're more than 150 years old. And so these organisations have a very real sense of themselves. But they don't really, individuals in there don't have a sense of their own identity. They feel as though they have to almost give up their own identity for the sake of the group. So if we've got too much, it doesn't foster drive or creativity or diversity of thought. However, if you've got too little of this functional network in operation, everybody is incredibly anxious, and this is where you end up getting backstabbed. This is where you end up with your word is not your bond. Integrity tends to lack. People feel as though they can't trust anybody in the group. So as a leader, the first thing that we're looking to do is to assess, do we have too much of the P1, too much of this first relatedness function? And you may have heard me mention there, P1 is what we call it at a technical level. This is a functional network within the brain. If you've got too much, then everybody ends up being bound. If you've got too little, everybody ends up being incredibly nervous and anxious, and so they're on red alert. But when you've got it about right, now the brain can relax and move on to other things. If it isn't right, you end up with blind compliance. You end up with people saying yes to things they don't agree with. This is sometimes referred to as a cult. Free thought and different thought is absolutely critical if you're going to have people working independently and creatively, and you're actually going to get diversity of thought. So the first breakthrough that we have is that relatedness is everything. And if people don't have a clear role within the group, I should mention at this point, this also includes the leader. In other words, in Australia in particular, now this may not be the case right across the world, but in Australia, often our leaders are not given the mandate to lead. So the leader feels incredibly anxious. And the rest of the group then feels incredibly anxious because the leader's so focused on their own security that they haven't got any time or emotional space to give security to somebody else. So the first area for us to focus on is getting the sense of security and role clarity right. Getting a code of conduct. Having shared values that the group can agree on. And in teamwork, there's a bigger picture here, which is that the team starts to wonder about, well, what's the value of this team relative to the rest of the organisation? So how clear is the role of the team in the organisation delivering on its value proposition and strategy? That's the first big breakthrough, relatedness. Here's the second, expression. It's absolutely essential. You either ooze it or you lose it. If you shut down expression, what tends to happen is we become obsessed. Unexpressed emotion is very negative for the brain. The brain doesn't like it. It becomes obsessive. If somebody doesn't have any money, they become obsessed with money. If somebody doesn't have a partner in life, they become obsessed with that. If somebody's angry, they become obsessed with the anger. In a group, in a team, if somebody feels as though they've been slighted, badly treated, if something isn't right, often what ends up happening is that they bottle it up and that becomes an obsession. Now, in practical terms, once again, it triggers the more primitive emotional parts of the brain. So if you've got a team that doesn't express itself, if those individual members can't say how they're feeling in the group, politically what happens then is and this is a technical term, they mask. They mask how they're feeling. So, for example, you and I are sitting in a team, I'm incredibly angry with you, but I don't express it. And I know that if I show that anger, things could go very pear-shaped. So in that situation, I mask how I'm feeling. What we know from the neuroscience is that when I'm masking, you don't know what emotion I'm masking, but your heartbeat goes up and your blood pressure goes up. In other words, if you are watching me mask, your heartbeat and your blood pressure go up because you know that something's not quite right, but you can't put your finger on it. So that doesn't do anything for your productivity. But what about my productivity? I'm masking. Matt Lieberman at UCLA found that up to 70%, a significant amount of your cognitive capacity can be impaired if you're putting all your attention on masking your emotions. So, what's the net impact? Well, the net impact is you can successfully mask your emotion, but it has a huge impact on your ability to be able to think through things, to work at a complex level. So if you've ever had a group of people and you say, so what do you think, team? What can we do about this? And a kind of hush goes across the group and people make fairly simple suggestions and not particularly sophisticated, and some of them can't even follow the nature of the issue, it could be that their cognitive ability has been impaired because they're busy masking how they're really feeling. So what can you do about it? Well, what you can do about it is you can get people to accurately label their emotion. And what we know is that when they label their emotion in front of the group, look, I'm feeling angry, just by labeling it, reduces significantly the amount of emotionality and the amount of activation of those primitive areas. So the second breakthrough is expression. Ooze it or lose it. If you've got too much expression in the group, you've got melodrama. You've got people who love theatre. And there are some organisations that, they're relatively profitable. They may be an older organisation. There's not that much to do. They've probably got 30-40% too many staff. And their staff can wander about taking up hours and hours of time, there's a lot of this in government organisations, with excessive emotion. It's a melodrama. Not a lot of work gets done, but there's a lot of theatre. But when you've got too little emotion being expressed, now what you've got is stupidity. And so organisations with perfectly intelligent people actually aren't working at their peak. What you're wanting is to have expression of the emotion and have permission to be able to express the emotion in a constructive way, but not something that then becomes the obsession of the group. You're wanting to have constructive emotional expression. And if you don't ooze it, you lose your cognitive capacity. So the first area is about this relatedness. It's about how you fit into the group. The second area is about feeling as though you've got permission to express how you're feeling. And if you can do that, already now a lot of the energy moves from the more primitive parts of the brain to the more advanced, the more modern parts of the brain. Here's the third breakthrough that we've discovered. This is massive. The third breakthrough is size matters. It's all about competing. What we're talking about here is we love the idea of status. When we do well, when we win, our brain goes nuts with all the neurochemicals that make us feel fantastic. So we constantly compare, we constantly compete. So if you can imagine, in the first area, relatedness is everything, what we want there is to have a role. That's one whole functional network within the brain, with its own neurochemicals and its own circuitry. But here's the second. Once you're a member of that group, now the race is on. Now what you want is to have more status, more success. You want to lead the pack. Now, if you've got too much of this, what ends up happening is that you've got a whole bunch of egocentric 2-year-olds, a whole bunch of people running around trying to compete, winning at any cost. Too much, and you've got extraordinary aggression, passive aggression, active aggression. You've got people in meetings competing to get the credit, white-anting, ambushing. But too little, and what ends up happening is everybody loses interest. Your team goes to sleep. There's no energy. There's nothing in it for people. What you're looking for is to get it about right. Now the question here is, how do you get a group of people in that sweet spot? How do you get them to the point where they're achieving as a team and they're not competing with each other, but they're competing with other teams? And this is about being able to talk to people about, well, what is it that's in it for you to be part of this team? What is it that is motivating you personally, and how can that now align with team goals? And it's about having shared team goals and shared team celebration, and knowing what it is that people are striving for so that you can compliment them on that. There's often a lot talked about in terms of compliments, and people, there's this whole question of what sort of a compliment do you like? You like compliments when you know you've achieved something, when you've worked hard and you like to be acknowledged for it. But often what we do is we give compliments to people when they're demoralized and when they haven't achieved anything. This actually doesn't make any sense to the brain. In fact, if anything, it demoralizes people because they get the sense that you feel sorry for them. And so back to the status piece, now you're actually putting yourself at a higher level of status than them. This leading the pack is central to energy. So if you don't have this right, what it means is that you don't have the goals of the individual aligned with the goals of the group. So if you've got no energy, if everyone's yawning all the time, everybody's exhausted, it usually means that we need to have a goal alignment session. Here's the fourth breakthrough. Now, this shouldn't surprise some of you. All you need, as Paul McCartney said, is love. It's all you need. This is fascinating because what we know about high-performance teams is that they have higher levels of oxytocin in their bloodstreams than teams that are low performance. Now, oxytocin is the love drug. Oxytocin is what young mothers have so that no matter what their child looks like, they think it's beautiful. It's a love drug that gives you a sense of connection, gives you a sense of forgiveness. You forgive more if you love somebody. Now, there's sexual love and then there's attachment. Attachment and sexual love are quite separate. People often get them confused. You can have two guys who have an almost love and attachment for each other but are not sexually interested in each other. Right? So sexuality and love, while there is an overlap, it doesn't have to be linked. It's more about attachment as love. And teams need to have attachment. And if you think of the teams that you've been in, you will love within the team, you will have attachment with everybody in that team. Some of them are high performers, some of them are low performers, some of them aren't all that bright, some of them are colossal big super brains, but together as a team, you accept each other's strengths, you work to each other's strengths, and so you work effectively. This is actually essential to a sense of wellness within the brain. So if you've got too much of this love, you end up with a therapy session. And there are some groups that overdose on love. There's too much oxytocin in the system. And so this is where groups that have been working together, often one of the telltale signs is that when you ask them about their competency levels, they all think they're fantastic. They've got high levels of self-forgiving and they forgive everybody else in the team. So if you've got too much, it's very hard to get excellence, very hard to push people that extra mile because, well, relax, everything's fine. But if you've got too little, it's like you've got a whole bunch of people on separate islands, two-dimensional people who nobody really cares about. And so I've often worked with IT people who, we had one team of IT producers and this was for a financial services bank, They brought us in because the team had already used 50 million of their budget and had basically wasted it because there was lots of duplication. One of the reasons for this is every one of those people in the team works separately. When we pulled them together to do team building, they were SMSing each other even though they were only sitting 2 people away. There was absolutely no real connection between people. It was just about information sharing. They had a genuine disregard for every other person within the team. Too little, and everybody's there just for themselves. They don't understand other people. They don't empathize. What you need is to have about right. And then you can take on extraordinary tasks. You can conquer things that would terrify normal teams because you've got this ability to connect. And you connect at an intellectual level and at a heart level. David Serban-Schreiber, who is a PhD from the US, talks about the fact that the brain and the heart have many of the same neurochemicals. Candace Pert was one of the first that identified that these neurochemicals influence the way we think. So our heart and our brain are connected into a system, and this system influences the way we can perform. What you're wanting is you're wanting to have a good, healthy respect and understanding of each other based on each other's strengths, not on each other's weaknesses. Based on what we are passionate and what we love about life and about each other, rather than the scuttlebutt and hearsay, which isn't forgiving at all. In fact, it's got nothing to do with love, it's got to do with resentment, and usually goes back to that second breakthrough that I talked about earlier, which is that people don't express. When people can't express, rather than focusing on each other's strengths, they usually moan and complain about each other's weaknesses. So here's our 5th breakthrough. An enormous amount of the brain, the occipital lobe, a large amount of the brain is about seeing rather than believing. You've got to see it to believe it. The eyes have it. Now, what this means is you've got to be able to track progress of the team. Just having a love-in isn't going to do it. So let's see how these are working. Let's say, for example, you've got your first need, which is to feel a sense that you are valued by the group. Let's say we've got that right. You're able to express as a group. Fantastic. You've got a healthy sense of competition. Terrific. You actually understand each other's strengths. Well, that's fantastic too. This is where we bring in the 5th breakthrough, which is the brain needs to be able to see that progress is being made. We need to be able to see that we're actually making ground. If we can't see that we're actually making ground, we get demoralized. So if we've got too much of this analysis, you end up with paralysis by analysis. You end up with the team looking at progress and going, what are we doing? What's happening? What's happening? But nobody's actually doing any of the work. But if you've got too little, this is where you can end up with teams performing incredibly badly but having a lovely time doing it. These are like a cross between community groups and therapy groups and family groups. They get together, they talk, they discuss, they have a lot of fun, but do they achieve anything? I mean, sometimes you can be involved in teams and you say, you know, guys, we've been meeting for 3 years now and I don't think we've achieved anything. Well, that's fine in a non-commercial environment. If you say, well, look, it's so much fun getting together, we'd like to keep doing it. Well, that's great. But in a commercial practice, you need to be able to feel confident that you're making progress. What you need is to be able to see that the decisions that you're making as a team are leading to good outcomes. And where you've got bad outcomes, where the things aren't going as you want, that's the best and highest use of the team to be able to come together and change the strategy and mend the strategy to get it right. Here's the 6th breakthrough, and it's absolutely critical for the brain. You need to have hope for the future, and you need to have a dream. If you don't have a dream, if you don't have a sense of where things are going, then what tends to happen is the brain imagines the worst. Our frontal lobes are really designed to be prediction machines. That's what they are. Every statement you make, you run a little program in your brain to say, how's that going to end up? Hi, how are you? Really well, thanks. This person really likes me. I think this is going to end as a very positive thing. Oh, not you again. I can't stand you. I had you in a meeting last week. I can't stand people like you. Now you're running a little prediction program in your brain to go, oh, I don't think this is going to go so well. You go out on your first date. It goes for 15 minutes. And the person who you went with leaves. This isn't going so well. Your brain now says, this is never going to go well. In fact, I don't like these sorts of dates. This isn't going to work for me long term. I can sense it. I can see it. I can feel it. Every moment of every day you're streaming forward and thinking about, well, what's the implication of this? You win a new piece of work. What's the new implication? You get a compliment from your boss. What's the implication of this? How is this going to move forward? Now, some people are so focused on how current action is going to work into the future that they're not actually focused on the present, on the here and now. So they're constantly dreaming. You may know people who've constantly got their travel brochures in their top drawer. They're saying, oh, next week's going to be fantastic. One day, eventually, everything's always off into the future. These people are slightly dreamy. We can link it back in the brain to alpha theta states. This is a very slow wave movement within the brain. So it's slow thought. Sometimes when you've had a little bit to drink and you start dreaming about, one day I'm going to retire. One day I'm going to get a yacht and I'm going to travel around the world. These are the one day thoughts. If you've got too much, you're very much in the one day. But if you've got too little, you're looking forward, but there's nothing to see. And so what tends to happen when you've got too little of this hope for the future is it's a bleak world. And this is one of the sources of depression. We look forward and we can't see it getting any better. But when it's about right, we can look forward, we can look enthusiastically to what's happening. This is one of the things that we've found. When you look at highly effective teams, there is a sense of hope for the future. Now, statistics can always be misleading. So one of the mistakes that people have often made is they've said, well, therefore, what we need to do is engineer an exciting vision for the future so that we're working towards the vision. Well, here's what we've found. When people belong and feel as though they're a valued member of the group, that was the first breakthrough that we talked about, the relatedness. And they feel as though they can self-express. So when they're angry, they can express it. When they're sad, they can express it. And they're respected. We don't get obsessed by it, but the rest of the group respects that. And they've got a technique or a methodology that the group has to be able to express it, be it humour or some other way. And they feel as though they're achieving their goals. And they feel a genuine love from and for the other members of the team. And they can see that they're making progress. All this leads to a sense of, I like this team. I like working with this group. I like being with these people. I hope I can keep doing this as long as I can. It comes from getting the first 5 right. This is quite different from saying, one day this group is going to be a fantastic whatever. I've got a great vision for this group, and everyone goes, great. In the meantime, I wish to heck my computer would work. I wish I could actually tell you how I'm feeling. I wish we had a good leader with this group. So what I'm arguing here is that this last need that the brain has, the breakthrough that we know is that the brain needs to be able to look at everything that's happening in their life and say, I would just like things to keep going the way they are. That would be fantastic. It's a lag indicator, not a lead indicator. So here's how to relish life. Your brain relishes life. It starts with relatedness. Once you've got the relatedness right, you feel secure in the group, that's when you feel comfortable to express. Only when you feel comfortable to express do you start then thinking, I want to be part of this group, but even more, I want to be a leader in this group. I want to be known to be brilliant for something. And only then do you start to connect. These layer on each other. Then you start seeing the progress that you're making, and then you have a sense of hope for the future. And the dream is that this will keep going. These layer on each other. Now, in practice, the order is as important as the activity. So if you're going to be building a team and you want to be able to build it in the most efficient way, don't talk about the dream for the team. When I was going through university, I was taught that the great leaders always start with a vision. That's absolutely true, but they don't have to share it. The first thing the leader needs to do is make sure that everybody in their team feels secure in the team. And there's a difference between secured and liked. They don't need to be liked. They need to feel as though they are valued in the group. That's the first thing. Then you go on to expression. Then you go on to competition, driving the team forward. If you don't do it in this order, what happens is that if you ignite the team with that passion at that third big breakthrough, you'll end up with politics and drama. You've got to start with the team cohesion. Then you move to expression, then to success, and so forth. Each layer transcends and includes the previous layer. So I'll explain that. The first phase is how the team operates, your code of conduct, how people feel as though they're part of the group, the family rules. Those family rules dictate how you can self-express. The royal family in England has a very different self-expression from, say, Ellen DeGeneres. These are very different cultural norms. I think of my family. My family has a Presbyterian background, and so at our dinner table it was a very structured affair, meaning that I would talk and nobody would talk over the top of me, and then there was always a polite 3 to 4 second pause, and then my brother would talk, and my mother and my father, and there are only two kids in the family. And so if, for example, one person spoke significantly more than anybody else in the group, then my mother would moderate and say, look, Peter, I think you've spoken a little bit too much now. We should get your brother to say a bit more. What's been happening today, at school with you? So in other words, it was very, very moderated. So you can imagine my shock and surprise when I started. I come from a regional area in Australia, in Bundaberg, in fact. You can imagine my shock and surprise when I went to Sydney. And in Sydney, it's much more like any other international town. People tend to be fairly enthusiastic. They talk over the top of each other. And at the end of a meeting, your value at the meeting is determined by how much you spoke. Well, I got to the end of the meeting and nobody had ever allowed the 3 second space. So, of course, I thought, how rude. Everybody's incredibly rude here. But the person who invited me along to the meeting said, Peter, you didn't add any value today. Next time I'd like you to say something, otherwise don't bother turning up. I can't stand consultants who don't say anything. So the point being, your background, your family, where you went to university, where you did your trade, your training is going to have had a huge impact on the way your relatedness expresses itself. What's interesting about relatedness, by the way, is that it's part of a brain that we call the implicit procedural memory. The key word here is implicit. You don't know what your relatedness rules are. And so you need to get the relatedness rules of your team right before you start to break them. In other words, before you start to move up that hierarchy. So each layer transcends and includes the previous layers. I'll give you another example. If you don't have the self-expression right, what happens is it mutates into the third area, which was that status area, and so people start ripping each other to shreds to try and increase their own status by decreasing the status of others. Each layer represents a functional network in the brain, and a functional network is a network of different parts of the brain that light up to achieve that function. And in Neuropower and the material that I've written, we actually track the different functional networks and what their role has been in the evolution of the brain and to foster survival for the race. Everyone is strong and weak in different areas. So what this means is you'll be strong. Some of you will be very strong in that first relatedness area, but not so strong, for example, in the status area. So you'll tend to be more group focused than individually focused. Others will be very, very strong in the individual area, but not as strong in the group area. So the implication of that is that if you're weak in some areas, you won't find those particularly interesting. In fact, because the neural pathways aren't as well established, you'll find them a bit exhausting. So in a team building session, when we're working on areas that one person likes, suddenly they spark up and they're enthusiastic and they've got loads of energy. Then we move to the next area where they don't have nearly as much strength in that area and they're yawning and they're saying, I don't understand why we're doing this. As a team, you can be high in all 6 because others make up for your weaknesses. And they'll make up for your weaknesses if you let them. So quite often what ends up happening otherwise is the functional areas that you're strong in, you'll try and dominate the discussion and bring everything back to that. So it's almost like, there's that great quote, when the only tool you have is a hammer, pretty much everything starts looking like a nail. If you're particularly strong in one of those functional networks, you'll try and solve everything by administering the thinking of that functional network rather than using the appropriate one. And teams can usually reach high performance in 3 to 5 years, but get these 6 right, and you can fast track to the same results in as little as 6 months. And we've seen it again and again and again. So the relish model is simply the acronym. It's the relatedness, expression, leading the pack, interpersonal closeness, seeing the facts, and hopefulness. When you've got each of those right, you start to relish teamwork. Here are the questions. Who am I? When you first go to and you're working with a team, who am I? Who are you? And what's my role in this team? Expression. Are we safe to express our feelings? Leading the pack. What are our goals? Are we clear on rewards, punishments, KPIs, and frameworks? How can I be a star in this team? Interpersonal closeness. Do I really understand you? And more to the point, do you really understand me? Do you know what I'm good at? Do you know what my passions are? Seeing the facts. What's really happening? What else do we need to make things happening? Are we making progress? And then hopefulness. How can we move this forward? How can we keep doing this? How can we have the team this successful in the future? So you can relish leadership, safety, difficult conversations, problem solvings, training, parenting, marketing, communications, TV commercials. We relish just about any area of expertise as long as it's linked to the human brain, because this is what your brain naturally does. It's thinking in terms of relish. So if you have a TV commercial, if you can follow the journey, the relish journey, if you've got a difficult conversation, if you're trying to do parenting, well, wow, there's a challenge. Why not follow the relish model? You can follow that in conversations. You can follow it when you're writing a letter. You can follow it when you're making a cup of tea. You can do it when you're designing a menu. Because the brain asks questions in that order, you can relish virtually everything in life. And that ends with one of our favourite questions. What do you relish? What do you relish in life? What do you love? What do you adore? What would you like to be able to then learn to relish? And you will relish it if you're able to follow the relish model.